Hello, welcome to Big Picture Monday. My name is Cali Black, here to tell you all the context, all the stories that you need to know in order to totally rock this week's Come Follow Me readings. This week we are studying two of the books of the minor prophets, and those are Amos and Obadiah. And we are studying them in their entirety. For Amos, that means 9 chapters. Don't worry, they are short chapters. And for Obadiah, that means only 1 chapter. And in fact, Obadiah is the shortest book in the Old Testament. So it is 1 chapter, and it is also a very small chapter as it is. So chapters 1 through 9 of Amos and chapter 1 of Obadiah is what we'll be studying this week. Last week I talked about how from now on, as we study these minor prophets, I think it is so important to know the stories and the backgrounds of who they are, because then that helps make their prophecies make a little bit more sense, and gives us kind of some guiding principles to look for and some themes as we are now studying their books this week. So I'm excited to talk about them. Just like last week though, Amos and Obadiah have no relation to each other. So I'm going to tell you 2 completely different sets of information here so that you can feel confident reading each of their stories. So let's start with Amos. Who was Amos? We know that Amos lived in the southern kingdom of Judah, right? After King David and King Solomon, all of Israel split into 2 kingdoms, northern kingdom of Israel, southern kingdom of Judah. So Amos lived in the southern kingdom of Judah. We know that he was probably like middle class because it says that he was a shepherd, but also that he owned the sheep, and owning the sheep meant that he had a little bit of money and possessions. Not wealthy, but he was doing okay. Now, the interesting thing about Amos is that he was actually called to preach in the northern kingdom of Israel. He's one of the only prophets that we have like official record of who was called to preach in a kingdom other than the one where they were born and where they were from. So Amos is from the southern kingdom of Judah, but he went into the northern kingdom of Israel to preach. Now, when did Amos live? Well, first of all, northern kingdom had to have been around at that time because he went and preached up north. It seems to be that Amos was about the same time as Isaiah in the southern kingdom, which we learned last week was also the same time that Hosea in the northern kingdom was preaching. So we read about Hosea last week. We've learned about Isaiah before. It's all around the same time. It's like right before the northern kingdom of Israel is about to fall and be conquered by the Assyrians. And now we learned that there's another prophet named Amos from the southern kingdom who preaches in the northern kingdom. Now, once again, though, we don't have any records of these prophets meeting each other. We don't know if they knew about each other or if they were just doing their own things. We have no idea. But around the same time, Amos gets his call to go serve in the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, what does Amos talk about? Amos's big theme, right? For a lot of these minor prophets, it's good to go in with like, what is their overarching point of view and their theme? Amos's big theme is condemning Israel for thinking that they are doing okay just because they're doing better than all the other nations around them. It's kind of an interesting point of view, right? He's pretty much, Amos's point is telling Israel, listen, you can't just say, oh, we're better than the wicked Assyrians, so we're doing fine. You are God's covenant people. And if you are God's covenant people, you have a higher standard to live to. You can't just compare yourself to what everyone else is doing and say, oh, well, at least we're not doing that, so we're good. That is Amos's point of view is, listen, you've got to hold yourselves to a higher standard. You can't be complacent and at ease just because compared to everyone else, you feel like you're not as bad as they are. So that's the big theme to look for in Amos. Love that theme. We're going to talk about that a lot more because that really hits home for, I think, a lot of us. Okay, now let's talk about Obadiah. Who is Obadiah? We only get one short, very, very short chapter from him. Obadiah was also from the southern kingdom and of Judah, but he's one of those guys we don't know too much about, but he does talk about seeing Jerusalem being conquered by Babylon. And so even though this technically happened a few different times, Babylon came in and conquered Jerusalem a few different times, most people like to assume that, okay, Obadiah must be talking about that big final conquering when Babylon came in and completely destroyed Jerusalem, got rid of the temple, destroyed the walls of the city. That's what we like to assume. Now, if that's the case, he lived at the same time as Jeremiah, right? We learned about Jeremiah a few weeks ago. Jeremiah was there in the city as it was conquered, as it fell. This also means that he probably lived around the same time that Ezekiel and Daniel were doing their thing over in Babylon. They had already been carried out earlier. So we like to say Obadiah is a contemporary prophet with Jeremiah, very likely, when he talks about the fall of Jerusalem that he sees. Now, what does Obadiah talk about in his very short chapter? This is interesting to me because if you read it through without any context, you might be like, why did I just read that? So I'm excited to tell you this context because it's actually a condemnation on the nation of Edom. Edom, Edom, and the Edomites, the people who lived there, which you might be like, cool, what's all that about? Well, here's what I find fascinating. Who are these Edomites? Edomites are descendants of Esau. Remember Esau? Esau is the older twin brother of Jacob. Rewind your mind history back all the way back towards the very beginning of the Old Testament. The older twin brother of Jacob, who became Israel later on, right? Got his name changed to Israel. He's the one Esau sold his birthright for a bowl of pottage. He seemed to be red and hairy. Their mother helped make sure that Isaac gave the blessing to Jacob instead of Esau. Esau was not very happy. And then we learn later on that they actually had a sweet reconciliation. Jacob and Esau did years later, after Jacob had established his family. So if you think about it, the Israelites are descendants of Israel, aka Jacob. So Esau, Jacob's brother, his descendants are not technically Israelites because they are not from Israel. However, they're very closely related, of course. And so as you're reading this condemnation for the nation of Edom, you're going to see Obadiah refer to Edom's brother very often. Like how you've sinned against your brothers, you have you've taken joy in your brother's suffering. Well, guess who that is referring to when we're talking about the Edomites' brothers? That is Israel. It's the Israelites. So we learned that there's a lot of animosity between the Edomites and the Israelites, talking about this brotherly relation because they literally are brothers if you go back far enough generations back. Kind of interesting. Okay, so that's the gist. That's the expectation that you can go in with both Amos and Obadiah. Let's dive into the chapters a little bit more, especially in Amos, to kind of get some ideas, and I want to give you a little more context for what's happening in some of these chapters. So remember Amos, from the southern kingdom, but called to the northern kingdom. You're going to see some themes as we go through these chapters. Amos really liked to once again, he's pointing out Israel's hypocrisy, right? Like saying other people are worse than we are, so we're fine. But he likes to also call out very wealthy people and people who are ignoring the poor. You'll see that that's a really big theme as we go through this. Okay, so let's start with Amos. Chapter 1 and 2, Amos does a fascinating literary strategy or speech strategy that I am obsessed with, okay? So chapter 1, he starts by condemning all these nations, like woe unto Syria and woe unto Edom and woe unto Ammon and all these other nations around them. He's saying woe, and he's telling why they're going to be destroyed and punished because they're not serving God. They've turned their hearts away from him. And you can just imagine everyone listening to him going yeah, that's right. Woe unto them. They are bad. They deserve that. And then we get to chapter 2, and he starts by saying, woe unto Moab. Those Moabites have totally turned away from the Lord. Absolutely. And then Amos says, and woe unto Judah, and woe unto Israel. And he gives the reasons why Judah and Israel also deserve to have their own godly punishment. Fascinating literary device of getting your audience to be like, yep, I agree. oh, wait a second. If I agreed with everything else you said, maybe there's something to what you're saying here at the end. They become a little more accepting to it, likely, at least hopefully in Amos's case. Chapter 3 in Amos has a very, very famous verse about prophets, so look for that as you're reading through it. I guarantee you'll be like, oh yeah, I've heard this one before. But Amos is pretty much saying, like, the Lord will always tell prophets what is going on. There's not going to be any surprises, so you need to listen to the prophets. Stop rejecting the prophets, because that hasn't turned out well for anyone in any sort of history. But he also prophesies Israel will turn away from prophets and they will be destroyed. Chapter 4, you'll see a location called Bethel named. Bethel is a town in the northern kingdom of Israel. Very, very important town, important for the government. It also was considered like a religious haven, an important place for religion, for like worship. Also a lot of very, very wealthy people lived in Bethel. Okay, so a very important, it wasn't the capital city, but it was a very important city when it comes to the kingdom of Israel. And he just talks about how there will be punishment towards Israel. Chapter 5, if Israel seeks after God, they will live, but they have been rejecting the poor. They've been turning away all the poor people, and they've been worshiping false gods in addition to trying to worship God at the same time, and that's going to be their downfall. Chapter 6, Israel is warned against feeling at ease in Zion. Don't feel at ease in Zion. They will eventually be conquered because they aren't actually turning to God with their full heart. Chapter 7, there is a Joseph Smith translation, so check out that. And Amos talks about when he was called to be a prophet, how his calling happened, how he prophesied that Israel will fall, and that there was someone who came to him and was like, listen, you are only becoming a prophet and prophesying for your own gain. And Amos basically says, no, I'm doing this because God called me. I'm getting no personal gain out of this. Chapter 8, Amos tells another story of when the Lord told him that Israel is going to be punished, and that the entire world will then fall into apostasy. And then final chapter, chapter 9, Israel will fall. They will be scattered, but Amos sees the light at the end of the tunnel. There will be a remnant of Israel that will be saved. And in the latter days, they will be able to return back to the land of their inheritance. All right, great themes for the book of Amos, talking about how we cannot be hypocrites. God's covenant people have a higher standard. Listen to the prophets. There is hope. We have to take care of the poor and the needy as well. Okay, moving on to Obadiah. I kind of mentioned this because there's really only one chapter, but basically it's a condemnation against the land of Edom and the Edomites, talking about how they need to be kind to their brothers, and that Edom will be destroyed because of their pride. And then what's interesting in Obadiah that I found really fascinating is that this is where the phrase saviors on Mount Zion originates. Maybe you've heard that phrase before. In the latter days, we consider that to be a phrase meaning saviors on Mount Zion are coming to redeem the dead, to do family history work, to take names to the temple, to bind generations together through the holy power of the priesthood. And so this is what Obadiah says in his prophecy. He says, Edom will be destroyed, but then saviors on Mount Zion will come and will judge the people and help deliver all the people that have been destroyed. So cool little connection there with family history work and being how we can also be saviors on Mount Zion to people who have died without knowing the truth and without making covenants with God. Okay, that's it for Amos and Obadiah. I think for my personal focus question, as if I haven't hinted to it enough, I love Amos's point of view and those first two chapters where he makes the point that God's covenant people are held to a higher standard. So I think my personal focus question is going to be, how can I avoid looking outward to judge how good I'm doing? How can I avoid looking outward to have that be the judge of how good I'm doing? I am guilty of that plenty of times, of thinking like, at least I didn't murder someone today. I think I'm doing all right. Which some days, listen, you gotta just tell yourself that. So I think, like, tongue in cheek, sometimes we do have to be like, you know what, I'm doing okay. I really am doing okay. But on a more like serious progress note, when you're actually looking at your progression towards the Lord, thinking, okay, I can't compare. I can't say, well, at least I'm not doing that, or I think I'm doing better than that person, so I'm okay. What can I do to avoid looking outward in order to judge my own progress towards the Lord? love Amos's thoughts on that, and I'm excited to share some of my thoughts this week as well. Okay, have a great week this week studying Amos and Obadiah, and we'll talk to you later. Happy studying.